Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we climb into a sleigh, wrap ourselves in something that smells vaguely of tallow and wood smoke, and ride into the frozen, fragrant, occasionally horrifying world of Peter the Great, the man who dragged Russia into modern Europe, kicking, screaming, and we should be honest, sweating. Picture a towering figure, nearly 7 feet tall by most accounts, striding through a palace where the air is thick with incense, mutton grease, and the low hum of superstition. This is not a lavender candle kind of history. This is the real, damp, occasionally eye-watering story of how one of history's most powerful men actually lived, day to day, paw to paw. And here's your cheeky little reality check before we go further. If you were transported back to Peter's court right now, in your regular 21st century body, you probably wouldn't survive the smell, let alone the smallpox.
Welcome to the Sleepy Historian channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with your location and your local time. I love picturing exactly where in the world you're drifting off tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the edge of a candlelit hall, somewhere in Moscow, sometime in the late 1600s, and the first thing that hits you, before you even see anyone, is the smell. It's not one smell, really. It's a whole orchestra of them. Beeswax candles guttering in iron sconces, the mineral tang of a stone floor that's never quite dry, the animal warmth of furs piled on furs, and underneath it all, that faint sour note of unwashed wool that seems to follow the entire Russian court like a loyal dog. You're here to understand a man, and to understand him, you first have to understand the air he breathed. This is the world that shaped young Peter Alexeyevich, long before he became the Great, long before his name became a shorthand for reform, war, and westernization. This is a boy growing up in a palace where hygiene isn't ignored so much as it's understood completely differently than we understand it today, where cleanliness is bound up with ritual, with the Orthodox Church, with steam and birch branches and startlingly cold rivers, rather than with soap bars and antibacterial gel. Historians still argue whether Peter's later obsession with European habits, his fascination with clean-shaven faces, tidy uniforms, orderly shipyards, was a genuine belief in hygiene as we define it, or simply another tool in his enormous toolbox for forcing Russia to look and act like the powers he admired. That debate matters for tonight's journey, because as you're about to discover, hygiene in Peter's world was never just about the body. It was about power, about identity, about which century you belong to. And Peter, more than almost anyone in his era, seemed determined to belong to a century that hadn't quite arrived yet. Let's set the scene properly, because sleepy history deserves good scene setting. The late 17th century in Russia is a place where the boyars, the old noble families, wear long heavy robes lined with fur, robes so voluminous that a man's actual physical hygiene becomes almost irrelevant. Nobody's checking under there. Beards are sacred, practically holy, a visible sign of orthodox piety, and a man without one is viewed with the kind of suspicion you'd reserve today for someone who shows up to a job interview in pyjamas. Meanwhile, several thousand miles west, in Amsterdam and London, gentlemen are beginning to shave their faces smooth, powder their wigs, and, bafflingly, hilariously from a modern viewpoint, avoid bathing in water almost entirely, because doctors there believe water opens the pores and lets disease pour straight in. Yes, you heard that right. Two civilizations, both convinced the other one had it backwards, and both, frankly, a little bit right and a little bit wrong at the same time. Into this collision zone walks Peter, a boy who by the age of 10 has already witnessed a palace coup, watched relatives be dragged out and killed in the Kremlin courtyards below his window, and developed a nervous facial tic that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This isn't just trivia, it's the emotional soil that grows into the adult Peter's restless, hands-on, almost manic curiosity about the wider world. A boy who can't fully trust the palace he grew up in starts looking outward, toward foreign quarters of Moscow where Dutch and German merchants live differently, dress differently, and yes, smell at least somewhat differently. That foreign quarter, known as the German suburb, becomes Peter's favourite escape, and it's here, among barrel-chested shipbuilders and beer-drinking foreigners, that his fascination with the West truly takes root. Quirky little tidbit for you, since your brain deserves something odd to chew on before sleep. Young Peter reportedly loved playing with a small collection of foreign tools and instruments gifted to his family, including, of all things, an old English astrolabe that nobody in the Kremlin could quite explain to him properly, so he found a Dutch merchant to teach him instead. That single moment, a boy hunting down a foreigner because the answer wasn't available at home, tells you almost everything about how Peter would eventually approach hygiene, technology, government, and basically all of Russian society. If the knowledge existed abroad and not at home, he'd simply go get it, or in some cases drag it home by the collar. So as you drift through this candlelit opening scene, keep one question simmering in the back of your mind, the way you'd keep a kettle simmering on a low flame. Was Peter the Great actually a clean man by the standards of his own time? Or was he, as so many towering historical reformers turn out to be, a walking contradiction, obsessed with modernising everyone else's habits while remaining in his own private moments thoroughly unapologetically Russian in his relationship with dirt, sweat and steam? We're going to find out together, slowly, one steamy bathhouse and one yank tooth at a time. And speaking of steam, there's a place in old Russia where the answer to how clean was clean enough gets a lot more interesting. A wooden room full of heat, birch branches and naked honesty that existed centuries before Peter was even born. And that's exactly where we're heading next. You duck your head beneath a low wooden doorframe, and suddenly you understand why every account of Peter the Great begins, eventually, with his size. This is a man built less like a monarch and more like a ship's mast, somewhere around 6 feet 8 inches tall, according to most estimates drawn from his surviving clothing and the frame of his preserved skeleton in St. Petersburg, which is remarkable considering the average Russian man of his era stood closer to 5.5 feet. Historians still argue over exactly how tall he truly was, since court flattery loved to exaggerate a ruler's stature, but even the most conservative modern estimates put him head and shoulders, quite literally, above nearly everyone he ever met. Imagine being a foreign ambassador, already nervous, already sweating through your formal coat, and having to crane your neck upward just to make eye contact with the man deciding whether your country gets a trade deal or a very cold war. That height came with consequences that ripple directly into our hygiene story tonight. A body that large needs proportionally larger everything. Larger meals, larger boots, larger beds custom built wherever he travelled, since standard furniture simply couldn't contain him, and a body under that much physical strain, moving constantly, working with his hands almost obsessively, sweats. A lot. Peter wasn't a monarch who lounged on cushions issuing decrees from a distance. He was, by nearly every surviving account, a man who could not sit still. He apprenticed as a shipwright in Amsterdam under a false name, hammering nails into hulls alongside actual labourers. He pulled teeth as a hobby, which we'll get to properly in a later chapter. Don't worry, that's coming. He personally operated lathes, built furniture, dabbled in surgery, and reportedly once helped extinguish a fire with his own hands, rather than simply ordering servants to do it. This is not a man whose hygiene routine involves sitting patiently while attendants powdered his wig. This is a man who came home most nights genuinely, physically filthy, in the honest, sweaty, sawdust under the fingernails way that royalty almost never experienced. And here's your mainstream historical fact for this section, the kind of thing that shows up in respectable biographies. Peter suffered throughout his life from a nervous tic, a facial spasm that grew worse under stress, believed by many historians to be linked to the childhood trauma of the 1682 Streltsy uprising, when armed guards stormed the Kremlin and murdered members of his own family in front of him. That trauma didn't just shape his psychology, it shaped his physical restlessness. Modern historians and even some contemporaries speculated that his relentless need to be constantly building, travelling, working, and moving was at least partly a way of outrunning the stillness in which those old memories could catch up to him. A body kept in constant motion doesn't get the luxury of a long leisurely soak. It gets quick dunks, hurried scrubs, and whatever cleaning ritual fits between the next shipyard visit and the next military campaign. Let's talk about what actually happened to that enormous frame on a typical day, because the physicality matters enormously to understanding Petrine hygiene. Peter rose early, often before dawn, which was itself unusual for a monarch of his era. European kings of the period were famous for elaborate hours-long morning rituals involving multiple servants, dressing them one garment at a time, a whole ceremony built around the simple act of putting on pants. Peter had no patience for that theatre. Accounts from courtiers describe him dressing himself quickly, often in the same plain, sturdy clothing day after day rather than rotating through an elaborate wardrobe. Something we'll dig into more in a later section, because his clothing choices are honestly one of the most surprising parts of this entire story. Here's your quirky, slightly fringe tidbit to tuck away for later. Some sources suggest Peter had unusually small feet and hands relative to his towering height, a detail obsessed over by later biographers trying to reconstruct exactly what he looked like, since no single portrait or death mask tells the whole story consistently. It's a strange little mismatch, a giant man with almost delicate extremities, and it's the kind of detail that makes you realise how much of history is actually just educated guesswork stitched together from fragments. Measurements of preserved clothing, court gossip, a few surviving gloves. We're never entirely sure we've got the whole man, only the pieces that happen to survive the centuries. Now, a body this large, working this hard, sweating this much, needed some form of relief, and Russia, unlike much of Western Europe at the time, actually had an answer ready and waiting. While London aristocrats were terrified of water, and French courtiers were dousing themselves in perfume to mask what soap wasn't allowed to wash away, Russia had inherited a completely different relationship with heat, steam, and the human body, stretching back centuries before Peter was ever born. This tradition didn't come from foreign advisors or Dutch shipbuilders. It came from home. It came from the Banya. And that word alone should tell you where we're headed next, because to understand how Peter the Great actually got clean, genuinely physically clean, not just symbolically clean through incense and ritual, you have to understand the wooden room filled with steam that had been a fixture of Russian life for as long as anyone could remember. A room that would have felt utterly alien to a powdered French courtier of the same era. And a room that Peter, for all his fascination with the West, never entirely gave up. Push open the low wooden door, feel the wall of heat hit your face like a held breath finally released, and you've arrived at the Banya, the beating, steaming heart of Russian hygiene, and honestly, one of the most sensible cleanliness technologies anywhere on Earth at the time. This isn't some exotic foreign concept we're bolting onto Peter's story for flavour. The Banya predates him by centuries, mentioned in chronicles as far back as the 10th century, when a Byzantine visitor described stunned amazement at Russians beating themselves with branches in wooden huts, and then, immediately afterward, plunging into freezing rivers or rolling in snow. To the Byzantine visitor, it looked like self-torture. To the Russians doing it, it was simply Tuesday. Here's the mainstream historical fact worth holding on to. The traditional Russian banya functioned essentially as a wet sauna, a small wooden structure heated by a stone stove, where water thrown onto hot rocks created thick, enveloping steam, and bathers would sit on wooden benches at different heights. The higher the bench, the hotter the air since heat rises, sweating out the grime, the stress, and, in the medical thinking of the time, the illness itself. Bathers would then strike themselves and each other with bundles of birch or oak branches called venek, a practice that sounds brutal described flatly, but was understood as improving circulation, exfoliating the skin and releasing the aromatic oils trapped in the leaves. And then came the part that made foreign visitors gasp audibly. The plunge. After roasting in that steam for as long as the body could stand it, bathers would run outside and dunk themselves in cold water, a nearby river, or, in winter, a snowbank, before heading back in to repeat the whole cycle 2 or 3 more times. Now here's your quirky, slightly fringe tidbit. The kind of detail that makes you sit up a little in your sleepy haze. Banyas in this era weren't segregated by gender in many rural areas the way you might assume, and foreign travellers wrote home in scandalised detail about extended families bathing together, generations at once, with what Westerners considered a shocking lack of modesty. To Russians, this wasn't scandalous at all. Nudity in the banya carried none of the sexual charge that European visitors projected onto it, since the entire cultural framework around the body was different. Historians still argue over how universal this mixed bathing practice actually was across different regions and social classes, since surviving accounts come disproportionately from foreign travellers who may have exaggerated or misunderstood what they were seeing, filtering it through their own scandalised Western lens. Whatever the precise truth, it's clear that Russian attitudes toward the naked, sweating body were dramatically more relaxed than what was developing in London, Paris or Vienna during the same century. And this is where the cultural collision really sharpens into focus, because at the exact same moment Russians were sweating happily in communal wooden huts, Western European medical authorities had convinced themselves that water was an active threat to human health. We'll dig much deeper into that particular European panic in the next section, I promise, but it's worth planting the seed here. While Peter's countrymen were essentially performing a fairly effective, if aggressive, form of skin cleansing and detoxification through heat and cold exposure, the aristocrats of the courts Peter would later admire and imitate were avoiding baths for months, sometimes years, at a stretch, relying instead on dry rubbing with linen cloths and truly heroic quantities of perfume. Peter grew up with the Banya as simply how bodies got clean, the same way you might grow up thinking a particular brand of toothpaste is just what toothpaste is. Court records and later biographical accounts describe him using the Banya regularly throughout his life, even after his travels through Western Europe exposed him to entirely different, and by most objective measures, less effective, approaches to personal cleanliness. This matters enormously for understanding the paradox at the centre of tonight's whole story. Peter would spend years forcing his nobles to shave their beards, wear German coats, and adopt European table manners, yet he never abandoned this deeply Russian steam and plunge ritual for the Western alternative of powder and perfume. In some quiet, sweaty way, the Banya was one tradition Peter never tried to modernise out of existence, perhaps because, unlike beards or bulky robes, it actually worked. There's a wonderful irony hiding in here that's worth savouring slowly, the way you'd savour the last warm sip of tea before sleep. Peter is remembered by history as the great westernizer, the Tsar who dragged Russia kicking and screaming toward European fashions, technologies and social customs. And yet, on the single most practical, physical, day-to-day question of how to actually get a body clean, Russia was arguably already ahead of the West, and Peter seemed to know it. He didn't import bathing habits from Amsterdam because Amsterdam, frankly, didn't have better ones to offer. The Dutch had superior shipyards, superior naval architecture, superior clockwork and lens grinding. But when it came to actual physical hygiene, the humble wooden banya, steam rising off hot stones, birch branches slapping against skin, was quietly, unglamorously, doing a better job than half the perfumed courts of Europe combined. Of course, none of this happened in a vacuum. Before Peter ever set foot on a ship bound for Holland, before he ever dreamed of European shipyards and English clockmakers, he was simply a boy inside the walls of the Kremlin, surrounded by candle smoke, court ritual, and the particular blend of piety and grime that defined Muscovite royal life in the late 17th century. To really understand the man who would later stand between two civilizations, one drenched in steam, one terrified of water, we need to step back into that childhood palace and see, close up, exactly what clean meant to the family that raised him. Picture a young Peter, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wandering the low stone corridors of the Kremlin's royal apartments, where the light comes mostly from oil lamps and the air carries that particular blend of incense, melted candle wax, and the mustiness of heavy embroidered fabric that's rarely, if ever, properly aired out. This is the world Peter was born into in 1672, the youngest son of Tsar Alexis by his second wife, and it's a world governed as much by ritual and superstition as by anything resembling what we'd now call practical hygiene. To understand young Peter's earliest relationship with cleanliness, you have to understand that Muscovite royal life treated the body less as a biological system to be maintained and more as a vessel of spiritual and political significance, wrapped, quite literally, in layers of meaning. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Russian Orthodox tradition placed enormous emphasis on ritual purity, particularly around religious observances, fasting periods, and the sacraments, and the royal household followed an exhausting calendar of feast days and fast days that shaped not just diet but daily behaviour, including bathing customs tied to specific religious occasions. Bathing before major holy days, for instance, carried spiritual weight beyond mere cleanliness. It was preparation for communion, a physical echo of spiritual renewal. This meant that, paradoxically, a boy raised in one of the most powerful households in Russia might go through stretches where bathing followed the liturgical calendar as much as any practical sense of, I feel grimy today, let's fix that. Young Peter's actual physical environment, meanwhile, was cluttered and layered in a way that modern minds might find almost claustrophobic. Royal children were dressed in heavy, elaborately embroidered garments regardless of the season, often multiple layers thick, following strict court protocol about how a Tsarevich ought to appear. These clothes were expensive, painstakingly made, and, Crucially for our story, not something you tossed in a wash bin after a single wearing. Fabric care in this era generally meant airing garments, brushing them, sometimes treating stains with various concoctions, rather than the full washing we'd expect today. A single elaborately embroidered coat might be worn for weeks or months between any deep cleaning, which meant that even a scrupulously bathed body could end up wrapped, day after day, in clothing carrying the accumulated evidence of court life: incense smoke, spilled wine, sweat, and whatever had been served at the previous night's extravagant feast. Now for your quirky, slightly fringed tidbit. Some historians have pointed to surviving Kremlin inventories listing enormous quantities of dried herbs, flowers, and aromatic substances used specifically to freshen clothing, bedding, and rooms, a kind of proto-air freshener system involving sachets tucked into chests and closets. This tells us something important, that Muscovite Russia was hardly indifferent to smell. They simply approached the problem from the angle of masking and refreshing, rather than the more thorough, if occasionally unreliable, Western obsession with perfume applied directly to unwashed skin. It's worth noting historians still argue over exactly how effective these herbal freshening methods actually were at controlling odour in a palace housing hundreds of people, extensive kitchens, animal furs, and the general chaos of 17th century royal life. But the intention, at least, points to a household that cared about pleasant environments, even if the tools available were fairly primitive by later standards. The Kremlin of Peter's childhood was also, frankly, a crowded and somewhat chaotic place, home not just to the immediate royal family, but to an enormous supporting cast of relatives, courtiers, servants, guards, and clergy, all moving through shared spaces, shared corridors, shared halls, waste disposal, water supply, and general sanitation in a compound this size, this old, and this densely populated presented genuine practical challenges that had little to do with anyone's personal habits and everything to do with 17th century urban infrastructure, or the near-total absence of it. Moscow itself, beyond the Kremlin walls, was largely a city of wooden buildings, unpaved streets that turned to thick mud with every rain or thaw, and a relationship with waste disposal that would make a modern city planner faint dead away. Chamber pots emptied into streets, animals wandered freely, and open drainage was, at best, a loose aspiration rather than a functioning system. Growing up amid all this, young Peter absorbed a set of assumptions about dirt, cleanliness, and the human body that were neither purely filthy nor purely clean by any single modern standard, but rather a complex, layered, deeply Russian Orthodox understanding where physical grime coexisted comfortably alongside spiritual purity, where a boy might bathe with real thoroughness before a holy feast day, and then spend the following weeks in the same heavy, unwashed court garments without anyone batting an eye. This is the paradox that would follow Peter into adulthood and across an ocean, a genuine inherited comfort with physical dirt as simply part of life's texture, balanced against a genuine capacity for real, intense cleansing ritual when the occasion demanded it. And it's precisely this comfort with contradiction that made Peter such a fascinating case study when, years later, he finally crossed into Western Europe and encountered an entirely different, and in many ways far stranger, set of assumptions about the body. A civilization that had, through a bizarre chain of medical reasoning, convinced itself that water itself, the very substance the Banya celebrated, was something to be feared, avoided, and kept as far from the skin as humanly possible. To understand just how strange that collision must have felt to young Peter, we need to step fully into the mindset of 17th century Western Europe, where doctors were telling perfectly reasonable people that taking a bath might actually kill them. Now let's cross an entire continent in the space of a breath, drifting from the incense-thick corridors of the Kremlin to the powdered, perfumed drawing rooms of Western Europe. Because to really appreciate how strange Peter's later travels must have felt, you need to understand just how bizarre European hygiene beliefs had become by the late 1600s. Here's your mainstream historical fact, and it's a genuinely wild one. Throughout much of early modern Europe, prevailing medical theory held that hot water opened the pores of the skin, creating tiny vulnerable openings through which disease, plague in particular, given how recently and viciously it had ravaged the continent, could invade the body directly. This wasn't some fringe folk belief whispered by uneducated peasants. This was mainstream medical opinion, taught by physicians, endorsed by universities, and followed devoutly by kings, queens, and the aristocracy, who could afford the best medical advice money could buy. The consequences of this belief were, from a modern vantage point, almost comically extreme. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, ruling in glittering splendour at Versailles during roughly the same era as young Peter's Kremlin childhood, reportedly bathed only a handful of times across his entire adult life, relying instead on daily changes of linen undergarments, which were believed to absorb sweat and impurities from the skin without the dangerous exposure of actual water contact. The theory went that clean linen, changed frequently, could essentially wash the body by proxy, drawing dirt and odour into the fabric rather than requiring the perilous act of full immersion. It's a theory that sounds almost logical until you remember these same courts were simultaneously drowning themselves in perfume, which tells you everything about how well the linen-only approach was actually working in practice. Here's your quirky, slightly fringed tidbit for tonight, and it's a genuinely delightful one. Because bathing was considered so risky, wealthy Europeans developed an entire secondary industry around scent, and Versailles in particular gained a reputation among visitors for its overwhelming combination of unwashed bodies, animal fat-based perfumes, and, this part often gets left out of the glamorous costume drama version of history, a genuine lack of adequate toilet facilities for the thousands of courtiers and staff who lived and worked there, leading to the palace's famously extensive gardens, serving double duty as, let's say, informal relief areas. Historians still argue over just how bad the smell of Versailles truly was at its peak, since some contemporary accounts may have been exaggerated by rival courts eager to mock French pretension, but the broader picture of a court obsessed with visual splendour while remaining fairly cavalier about actual sanitation is well documented across multiple independent sources. What makes this era so fascinating for our purposes tonight is the sheer diversity of hygiene philosophy existing simultaneously across the same broad continent. While the French court avoided bathing out of genuine medical terror, the English were developing their own particular blend of dry cloth rubbing and selective, cautious water use, generally reserved for hands and face rather than full-body immersion. Meanwhile, the Dutch, and this detail matters enormously for where Peter's story is headed next, had developed a reputation, deserved or not, for being somewhat cleaner and more orderly than their neighbours, particularly regarding public infrastructure, canal maintenance, and domestic tidiness, even if full bathing remained relatively rare there too. It's worth noting that cleaner in this context is always relative. Nobody in 17th century Western Europe, from the wealthiest duke to the humblest merchant, was showering daily the way modern audiences might assume, and even the most fastidious households of the era would strike a time-travelling modern nose as fairly ripe. This entire cultural landscape becomes essential once you realise where Peter was headed. As a young ruler increasingly obsessed with all things Western, shipbuilding, science, military technology, governance, he was on a collision course not just with European machinery and ideas, but with an entirely different, and in many ways objectively less effective, approach to the human body itself. And here's the delicious irony worth sitting with as your eyelids grow heavier. Peter arrived in a Europe that considered itself the pinnacle of civilization, a continent he genuinely admired and sought to emulate in nearly every visible way. And yet on this one particular question, how does a person actually get physically clean? The civilization he was so eager to imitate was, by nearly any practical measure, less effective than the steaming wooden bathhouses he'd left behind in Russia. This tension between admiration and contradiction would define so much of Peter's later reign. He would return home determined to make Russians shave their beards like Dutchmen, dress like Germans, build ships like the English, and organise their government like continental bureaucracies. And yet, through all of it, the humble Russian Banya would quietly persist, largely unchallenged, because even a Tsar hell-bent on westernising every visible surface of his nation could apparently tell on some instinctive level that the steam and cold plunge worked better than powdered wigs and month-old linen. And that instinct is about to get tested directly, because we're finally ready to follow young Peter out of Russia entirely, incognito, disguised among a diplomatic delegation, eyes wide open, about to witness Western Europe's strange and glittering world first-hand for the very first time. You board an imaginary ship alongside roughly 250 Russians, most of them officials, translators, and young nobles sent to study Western skills, and somewhere among them, disguised under the alias Peter Mikhailov, travels the actual Tsar of Russia, tall enough that the disguise fools almost nobody who bothers to look twice. This is the Grand Embassy of 1697 to 1698, one of the most extraordinary journeys any reigning European monarch had ever undertaken, and it's about to hand young Peter the biggest culture shock of his entire life. Here's your mainstream historical fact to anchor this scene. Peter travelled through the Baltic states into Prussia, through the Dutch Republic, and eventually to England, spending months working hands-on in shipyards, particularly at the Dutch East India Company's yards in Zaandam and later in Amsterdam, learning shipbuilding not as an observer but as an actual labourer, hammer and adze in hand, living among ordinary workers rather than in royal accommodations befitting his actual rank. What Peter encountered in Holland absolutely reshaped his understanding of what an advanced functioning society could look like, and hygiene, infrastructure and daily order were tangled up in that impression, whether Peter consciously separated them out or not. The Dutch Republic of the late 1690s was, by the standards of the era, remarkably orderly. Canals maintained on regular schedules, streets in major cities at least partially paved, a genuine, if imperfect, system of urban sanitation, and a merchant middle class whose homes were famously almost obsessively tidy, scrubbed doorsteps and polished brass fixtures becoming something of a cultural signature that visitors commented on repeatedly. Peter, coming from a Moscow where unpaved streets turned to thick mud with every rainfall, found this orderliness genuinely astonishing, and it clearly left a mark, because tidiness, order, and visible cleanliness of public space would become recurring obsessions in his later reforms back home. But, and this is important for keeping our story honest, Dutch domestic tidiness did not necessarily translate into personal bathing habits that would impress a modern audience. Full-body bathing remained relatively rare even in the cleanest Dutch households. The famous Dutch obsession with scrubbed floors and polished windows coexisted comfortably with the same general European wariness toward full-body water immersion we discussed a moment ago. So Peter wasn't necessarily encountering a civilization that bathed more. He was encountering one that organised itself more visibly, more functionally, and it's worth being honest that Peter, ever the practical mind, seemed most interested in exactly the parts of Dutch and English society that could be measured, built and replicated. Shipyards, dockyards, workshops, rather than abstract questions of personal hygiene philosophy. Here's your quirky, slightly fringe tidbit worth tucking away. While working incognito in the Zaandam shipyards, Peter reportedly insisted on performing the dirtiest, most physically demanding labour himself, refusing special treatment even when his identity became something of an open secret among the workers, and multiple accounts describe him coming home each evening genuinely, thoroughly filthy with pitch, sawdust and sweat, embracing exactly the kind of honest manual grime that most European monarchs of the era would have considered beneath their dignity to even witness, let alone experience firsthand. Historians still argue over how much of this hands-on labour was genuine hunger for knowledge versus a kind of theatrical humility designed to win over sceptical Dutch craftsmen and demonstrate Russian seriousness about learning. Quite possibly it was both simultaneously, since Peter was never a man who separated performance from sincerity particularly cleanly. England provided its own set of revelations. Peter spent time in London and at the naval facilities in Deptford, and one particularly memorable episode involves the house Peter and his entourage rented from the diarist John Evelyn, which the Russians reportedly left in a state of such extraordinary destruction, broken furniture, ruined paintings, filth ground into every surface, that Evelyn's agent submitted an enormous damage claim afterward, a claim partially covered by the English crown itself, embarrassed on Russia's behalf. This delightful little historical footnote tells you something important. Peter's fascination with Western order and cleanliness in the abstract, in shipyards and city planning, did not necessarily extend to his personal entourage's day-to-day domestic habits, which apparently remained thoroughly, chaotically Russian, regardless of which country's floors they happened to be tracking mud across. What Peter absorbed from this entire journey wasn't a coherent, unified philosophy of hygiene so much as a collection of impressions, admirations and ambitions that he'd spend the rest of his reign trying to translate into Russian reality. He saw orderly streets and wanted orderly streets. He saw functioning shipyards and built functioning shipyards. He saw clean-shaven faces on Dutch merchants and English gentlemen, and decided, somewhat abruptly, that Russian beards needed to disappear too, a decision we'll explore properly in a later section, because the beard tax alone deserves its own unhurried telling. But amid all this admiration and ambition, Peter also picked up smaller, stranger fascinations along the way, hobbies that had little to do with grand policy and everything to do with his restless, hands-on curiosity. And one of the strangest, most enduring of these hobbies involved teeth, specifically other people's teeth, and Peter's newfound, thoroughly amateur enthusiasm for yanking them straight out of unsuspecting courtiers' mouths. Somewhere along his European travels, Peter developed a fascination that would follow him home and terrify his court for decades afterward. Dentistry, or at least his own enthusiastic, thoroughly untrained version of it. Here's your mainstream historical fact to open this particular chapter of tonight's story. Peter genuinely studied basic surgical and dental techniques while in Western Europe, observing real practitioners at work, acquiring actual period dental instruments, including a toothkey, a metal tool resembling a small hooked lever used to grip and twist a tooth loose from its socket, a device that required real strength and a certain confident recklessness to operate effectively. Peter acquired several such instruments during his travels and brought them home to Russia, where he apparently found the whole business of pulling teeth so satisfying that he continued practicing it on real people for the rest of his life. Now, to be fair to Peter, 17th and 18th century dentistry wasn't exactly a refined profession, even among trained practitioners. There was no formal licensing system separating a barber surgeon from a self-taught enthusiast in most of Europe at this time, and tooth extraction was viewed less as a delicate medical procedure and more as a straightforward, if painful, mechanical fix, something closer to pulling a stubborn nail than performing surgery. Given that framing, Peter's hobby makes a bit more sense. He wasn't crossing some sacred medical boundary so much as dabbling in a trade that plenty of amateurs practiced. What makes Peter's version genuinely remarkable, though, is the sheer scale and eagerness of his enthusiasm, combined with the terrifying detail that he was the Tsar, meaning refusing his dental attention carried rather more social risk than declining a neighbourhood barber's offer. Court records and later historical accounts describe Peter keeping a personal collection of extracted teeth, allegedly a rather substantial one, pulled from courtiers, soldiers and servants, who, for one reason or another, found themselves unable to politely decline the Tsar's offer of dental assistance. Picture the scene. You're a nobleman going about your business at court, you happen to mention a nagging toothache within earshot of Peter, and suddenly the actual Emperor of all Russia is approaching you with a metal hook and a look of genuine enthusiasm, and there is functionally no polite way to say no. Some accounts suggest Peter occasionally misjudged which tooth was actually causing the problem, extracting a perfectly healthy one before realizing his error, which is exactly the kind of detail that would keep you wide awake with anxiety if you were a courtier in this era, but which now, safely removed by 3 centuries, counts as darkly comic bedtime material. Here's your quirky, slightly fringed tidbit, and it's a genuine gem. The collection of teeth Peter reportedly pulled and kept is sometimes displayed, or at least referenced, in Russian museum collections related to Peter's personal effects, alongside his surgical instruments and other hands-on tools he collected obsessively throughout his life, treating medicine, shipbuilding and craftsmanship all as branches of the same restless curiosity about how things worked and how a skilled hand could fix them. Historians still argue over how much of this dental hobby reflected genuine scientific curiosity. Peter was, after all, broadly interested in the emerging sciences of his era, corresponding with European scholars and supporting the eventual founding of Russia's Academy of Sciences, versus a somewhat darker enjoyment of exercising physical power over the bodies of people who had no realistic ability to refuse him. Both explanations likely hold some truth simultaneously, and that particular tension, curiosity braided together with unchecked authority, runs through nearly every strange hobby this particular emperor ever took up. It's worth pausing here to connect this back to our larger hygiene story, because dental health and oral hygiene in this era were, frankly, dismal across nearly every level of society, and Peter's enthusiasm for extraction, however alarming by modern standards, actually addressed a genuine and widespread problem. Sugar consumption was rising among wealthy Europeans, dental care remained rudimentary at best, and rotting, aching teeth were an ordinary expected part of adult life, rather than the exception. Toothbrushes, as we'd recognise them, barely existed in Russia at this point. Oral cleaning, when it happened at all, involved chewed twigs, cloth rubbed across the teeth, or various homemade powders and rinses, none of which came close to preventing the decay that made Peter's Toothkey such a regularly requested, or regularly imposed, tool. So while Peter's dental hobby sounds, on first hearing, like a strange historical footnote worth a chuckle before bed, it actually sits at the intersection of several bigger threads running through tonight's whole journey. His hands-on, almost compulsive need to personally master practical skills, rather than simply command others to perform them, his genuine if amateur interest in the emerging sciences of his time, and the simple, unglamorous reality that dental suffering was universal in this era regardless of social rank, which meant even an emperor's crude intervention, painful as it must have been, occasionally counted as a mercy. And speaking of things worn close to the body day after day, whether teeth or clothing, it's time we turned our attention to Peter's actual wardrobe. Because a man this indifferent to elaborate court ceremony, this eager to get his hands dirty in shipyards and dental chairs alike, dressed in a way that scandalised his own court almost as much as his Toothkey did. You lean in close to examine what the Emperor of all Russia is actually wearing, and if you were a foreign ambassador arriving at court expecting the usual blinding splendour of royal fashion, you'd probably do a double take. Because Peter's everyday wardrobe was, by most surviving accounts, remarkably plain, sturdy, practical, often visibly worn, sometimes genuinely patched or repaired rather than replaced. A stark contrast to the jewel-encrusted extravagance you might expect from a man ruling the largest territory on Earth. Here's your mainstream historical fact for tonight. Multiple surviving accounts from foreign visitors and Russian courtiers alike describe Peter favouring simple, practical clothing suited to whatever task occupied him that day. Whether that meant a plain naval coat while inspecting ships, rough workman's clothes while labouring in a shipyard, or a relatively modest military uniform even on occasions where elaborate court dress would have been expected. Several of his actual preserved garments kept in Russian museum collections today show visible wear, mended seams, and surprisingly modest materials for a man of his rank, which tells its own quiet story about how he actually lived, versus how monarchs were traditionally expected to present themselves. This matters enormously for our hygiene story tonight, because clothing in this era functioned as a primary hygiene technology in its own right, remember, absorbing sweat, providing a barrier between skin and the outside world, standing in for actual bathing in places where bathing was avoided out of medical fear. A wardrobe worn hard repeatedly, without the elaborate rotation and careful laundering that wealthy European courts practiced, would accumulate exactly the kind of grime, sweat and odour you'd expect from genuinely active daily use. Peter wasn't rotating through dozens of pristine embroidered coats the way Louis XIV's court demanded. He was wearing the same practical items repeatedly, hard, in physically demanding conditions, which almost certainly means his actual day-to-day smell profile, so to speak, was considerably more honest and considerably less pleasant than the powdered, perfumed ideal his own reforms were nominally pushing Russian nobility toward. Here's your quirky, slightly fringe tidbit worth savouring. Historians examining Peter's surviving clothing have noted that some garments show evidence of having been let out or adjusted, suggesting Peter, despite his relatively simple tastes, still had items tailored and retailored to fit his unusual towering frame, rather than simply purchasing new pieces, a practical, almost frugal habit that sits oddly alongside his reputation as a lavish, reform-minded emperor pouring enormous state resources into new capital cities and modern navies. It's a small domestic detail, the kind of thing easy to overlook amid grand narratives of war and westernization, but it paints a picture of a man whose personal habits remained surprisingly modest, even as his public ambitions grew increasingly enormous. Historians still argue over how much of this apparent frugality reflected genuine personal preference versus simply Peter's well-documented impatience with anything that struck him as wasted time or unnecessary fuss. Tailoring new clothes constantly, after all, requires standing still for measurements, and stillness was never Peter's strong suit. The beard reforms deserve their proper moment here too, since clothing and facial hair were deeply intertwined symbols of Russian traditional identity that Peter targeted almost immediately upon returning from his grand embassy travels. In 1698, shortly after returning home, Peter began personally shaving the beards of boyars at court, sometimes wielding the razor himself in scenes that must have been simultaneously comic and genuinely humiliating for the nobles involved. Men for whom a beard represented not vanity, but deep religious and cultural significance, a visible marker of orthodox piety stretching back generations. Peter followed this up with a formal beard tax in 1705, requiring men who wished to keep their beards to pay an annual fee and carry a small metal token proving they'd paid it, essentially monetizing traditional Russian masculinity in service of his broader westernization agenda. This wasn't hygiene reform in any practical sense. Beards themselves posed no particular sanitary problem, but it was absolutely presentation reform, an attempt to make the Russian elite visually resemble the clean-shaven Dutch and English gentlemen Peter had so admired during his travels. What emerges from all this, when you put the plain workman's coats alongside the enforced clean-shaven faces, is a picture of Peter using appearance as a deliberate political tool, while remaining, in his own private daily habits, fairly indifferent to personal luxury or elaborate self-presentation. He cared enormously about how his court looked collectively, as a symbol of Russia's modernization, while caring comparatively little about his own individual comfort, cleanliness, or sartorial splendor on any given ordinary day. It's a fascinating contradiction. A man reshaping an entire nation's relationship with facial hair and fashion, while personally content to wear a mended coat that had clearly seen better days. And having glimpsed what Peter wore, it's only natural that our sleepy journey now drifts toward what Peter and his court actually ate and drank together. Because the Petrine banquet table, as you're about to discover, was its own spectacular, chaotic collision between refinement and absolute mayhem. Settle in at the long banquet table now, because Petrine feasts were legendary events, and not always for reasons that would impress a modern etiquette coach. Here's your mainstream historical fact to open this course of tonight's meal. Russian court banquets under Peter often stretched for hours, sometimes entire days, involving enormous quantities of food. Roasted meats, fish, elaborate pastries, imported delicacies increasingly available as Peter's reforms opened trade routes westward, alongside truly staggering amounts of alcohol with vodka, wine and beer flowing continuously, and, crucially, often served in a manner designed to ensure guests couldn't easily abstain or moderate their consumption even if they wanted to. Refusing a drink at a Petrine feast wasn't simply impolite, it could genuinely offend the emperor himself, who took personal pride in his court's capacity for extravagant, exhausting hospitality. The hygiene implications of this banquet culture are, frankly, delightful in their chaos. Picture dozens, sometimes hundreds, of guests packed into a great hall, eating with hands and simple utensils since the elaborate individual place settings and dedicated cutlery we associate with formal dining today were still evolving even in the most sophisticated European courts of this era. Napkins existed, but were used inconsistently. Communal serving dishes meant guests reached, grabbed and shared food in ways that would make a modern public health inspector faint. Spilled wine, dropped food and the general debris of a multi-hour feast accumulated on tables, floors and inevitably on the increasingly dishevelled clothing of guests who'd been drinking steadily since midday. And remember everything we discussed about 17th and 18th century laundering practices? Clothing wasn't washed after every single wear, meaning a banquet's worth of spilled sauce and wine stains might linger on a nobleman's coat for considerably longer than anyone today would find acceptable. Here's your quirky, slightly fringed tidbit worth tucking away. Peter reportedly enjoyed personally overseeing and occasionally enforcing the drinking habits of his court, sometimes requiring guests to drain enormous ceremonial cups. The Great Eagle Cup being a particularly notorious example, an enormous vessel holding well over a litre of strong alcohol, as a kind of loyalty test or punishment for arriving late or otherwise displeasing the emperor. Anyone who's ever nursed a hangover after a single overly enthusiastic evening can only imagine the collective physical state of a Petrine court the morning after one of these command performances, and it's worth noting that a room full of people sweating out that much alcohol, packed together in close quarters without modern ventilation, would have produced an atmosphere that no amount of incense or dried flower sachets could fully mask. Historians still argue over how much of this heavy drinking culture reflected genuine Russian tradition, predating Peter, versus how much Peter himself amplified and formalized it as a deliberate tool of court control, using alcohol tolerance as an informal test of loyalty and toughness among his inner circle. The physical setting for these feasts adds another layer worth appreciating. Large gatherings in enclosed spaces heated by roaring fireplaces to combat Russian winters. packed with bodies already wearing multiple heavy layers of clothing, engaged in hours of eating, drinking, and increasingly enthusiastic socializing, would have generated heat and humidity levels that turned even the most carefully perfumed courtier into a sweating, flushed mess well before the evening concluded. Add candle smoke, the smell of roasted meat lingering in fabric and hair, spilled drinks fermenting quietly in corners, and you have an environment that, while undoubtedly festive and full of genuine warmth and celebration, was also a genuinely intense sensory experience by any standard, let alone a modern one accustomed to climate control and regular laundering. It's worth pausing to note that this wasn't uniquely Russian excess. European courts of the same era hosted similarly enormous, exhausting banquets, and the reputation of various royal courts for gluttony and heavy drinking was fairly widespread across the continent. What made the Petrine version distinctive was the particular blend of traditional Russian hospitality customs, which emphasized generous, almost aggressive feeding and toasting of guests, combined with Peter's own personality, which favored intensity, endurance, and a kind of rough camaraderie over refined restraint. Peter genuinely seemed to enjoy testing his court's stamina, treating banquets partly as social bonding rituals and partly as informal tests of loyalty and toughness, blurring the line between celebration and endurance challenge in a way that would exhaust most modern dinner guests within the first hour. And speaking of Peter's taste for testing his court's endurance through elaborate, exhausting rituals involving alcohol, we've arrived at exactly the right moment to introduce one of the strangest, most delightfully irreverent institutions of his entire reign, a mock religious organization Peter created specifically to drink, mock, and satirize the very institutions of piety and pomp that had governed so much of Russian court life before he took the throne. An institution that took the chaos of the banquet table and turned it into something even stranger, more theatrical, and considerably more scandalous. Let your imagination wander now into one of the strangest institutions Peter ever created, an organization with a name that sounds almost too absurd to be real, the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. Here's your mainstream historical fact to anchor this peculiar chapter. Peter established this mock religious drinking society sometime in the 1690s, and it functioned as an elaborate, sustained parody of Orthodox Church hierarchy and ritual, complete with its own prince-pope, mock bishops, absurd ceremonial vestments, and drinking rituals structured to satirize the solemn liturgical processions of the actual church. Members of Peter's inner circle held official-sounding titles within this fake hierarchy, participated in elaborate mock ceremonies, and were expected to drink themselves into genuinely impressive states of intoxication as part of the organization's core ongoing activities, all under Peter's personal direction and enthusiastic participation. What makes this institution so relevant to our hygiene story tonight isn't just the drinking, impressive as the quantities apparently were, but the specific, deliberately transgressive rituals Peter designed around bodily functions and physical degradation as a form of pointed satire against church pomposity and formality. Accounts describe ceremonies involving mock baptisms performed with alcohol rather than holy water, participants dressed in ludicrous parodies of religious vestments, and general behaviour explicitly designed to be as physically undignified, as gloriously filthy and chaotic as possible. The entire point being to invert and mock the solemn dignity the Orthodox Church demanded in its actual ceremonies. This was Peter using deliberate, orchestrated grubbiness and disorder as a political and cultural weapon, which adds a fascinating dimension to everything we've discussed so far about his personal relationship with dirt and cleanliness. Here's your quirky, slightly fringed tidbit worth savouring. Some accounts describe elaborate processions organised by this mock synod, involving participants riding on pigs, goats, or other unglamorous animals rather than horses, dressed in intentionally ridiculous mismatched costumes, parading through Moscow's streets in scenes that must have looked like an early, unhinged carnival, crossed with performance art centuries before either concept had proper names. Historians still argue over precisely how much of this activity reflected genuine anti-clerical sentiment on Peter's part, a real frustration with what he viewed as the Orthodox Church's excessive wealth, political influence, and resistance to his reform agenda, versus simple, uncomplicated enjoyment of debauchery and spectacle among a tight-knit group of powerful men who could, given Peter's authority, get away with almost literally anything they wanted without consequence. This institution offers a genuinely useful lens for understanding Peter's broader, complicated relationship with formal ritual and physical propriety throughout his entire reign. Here was a man capable of tremendous formal ceremony when it suited his political purposes, elaborate military triumphs, carefully staged diplomatic receptions designed to impress foreign visitors with Russia's new sophistication, and yet, in his private and semi-private social life, Peter seemed to take genuine, gleeful pleasure in the opposite extreme, in deliberately staged filth, chaos, and physical degradation as a release valve from the formal demands of rulership. It's worth remembering that this is the same man who personally worked in shipyards covered in pitch and sawdust, who kept a collection of teeth pulled from courtiers, who dressed plainly while ruling an empire capable of far greater splendour. The mock synod fits this pattern perfectly. Another arena where Peter deliberately, enthusiastically chose grime, disorder, and physical excess over the polished formality his rank technically demanded. There's also a serious political dimension worth acknowledging before we drift onward, because the Orthodox Church represented one of the few institutions in Russia with independent authority and popular legitimacy that could theoretically rival or resist the Tsar's power, and Peter's later reforms would go on to formally subordinate the Church to state control, abolishing the position of patriarch entirely and replacing it with a state-controlled governing body. The Drunken mock synod, absurd and gloriously undignified as it appears from a distance, likely served as an early informal expression of Peter's genuine determination to diminish the Church's independent authority, using satire and deliberate mockery as a kind of psychological softening before the more formal institutional reforms arrived years later. Historians still argue over the exact balance between genuine political calculation and simple personal enjoyment in Peter's participation, and honestly, given everything we've learned about this particular emperor tonight, there's no strong reason to assume it had to be purely one or the other. As the mock synod's chaotic ceremonies remind us, physical filth and disorder weren't always accidents of 17th century life in Peter's Russia. Sometimes they were deliberately, gleefully chosen, but not every source of grime and danger in this era was a matter of choice. And as our sleepy journey continues, it's time to turn towards something far less comic and considerably more frightening. The diseases that stalked every level of Russian society during Peter's reign, from smallpox to plague, and the crude, often desperate medical responses available to a civilization still centuries away from understanding what actually caused these illnesses in the first place. Let the mood settle now into something a little more sober, a little more hushed, because we're stepping into the genuinely frightening medical landscape of Peter's Russia, where disease wasn't an abstract historical footnote, but a constant looming presence shaping nearly every family's daily life. Here's your mainstream historical fact to open this section. Smallpox remained one of the deadliest and most feared diseases across Russia and the whole of Europe throughout Peter's reign, killing indiscriminately across social classes, disfiguring survivors with permanent scarring, and occasionally reshaping royal succession entirely when it struck ruling families directly. Plague, too, remained a recurring, devastating threat, with serious outbreaks striking Russian territories periodically throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, capable of emptying entire towns within weeks when conditions allowed the disease to spread unchecked through crowded, poorly sanitized urban populations. Medical understanding of these diseases in Peter's era remained, by modern standards, almost entirely disconnected from actual causes. The dominant medical framework across Russia and Western Europe alike still relied heavily on humoral theory, the ancient belief that the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness resulted from these humours falling out of balance. Treatments accordingly focused on restoring balance through methods that sound genuinely alarming today. Bloodletting, deliberately opening a vein to drain what was believed to be excess blood. Purging, through induced vomiting or aggressive laxatives, and various dietary restrictions believed to correct whichever humour had supposedly overwhelmed the others. None of this addressed actual pathogens, since the germ theory of disease remained roughly a century and a half away from formal scientific acceptance, but these treatments were applied with genuine confidence by trained physicians who believed, sincerely, that they were following sound medical science. Here's your quirky, slightly fringe tidbit worth tucking away tonight. Alongside formal humoral medicine, Russian folk practice maintained an enormous parallel tradition of herbal remedies protective charms and religious rituals believed to ward off or cure illness, often blending seamlessly with orthodox religious practice in ways that modern observers might find surprising. Certain icons were believed to hold particular protective power against specific diseases, and processions carrying sacred images through plague-stricken towns were a genuine, widely practiced response to outbreaks, reflecting a worldview where physical illness and spiritual protection were deeply intertwined rather than treated as entirely separate categories the way modern medicine would insist upon. Historians still argue over how much genuine therapeutic value, if any, existed within these folk and religious practices beyond the psychological comfort of ritual and community solidarity during terrifying outbreaks, though modern scholars increasingly acknowledge that some traditional herbal remedies did contain genuinely active compounds, even if the theoretical framework explaining why they worked was often entirely wrong. Peter himself took a personal, genuine interest in medicine that went considerably beyond his amateur dental hobby we discussed earlier. He supported the establishment of hospitals and medical schools in Russia, recruited foreign physicians and surgeons to train Russian practitioners in more current European techniques, and generally pushed to modernize Russian medical practice alongside his broader westernization agenda, even though modern European medicine of this era, as we've just discussed, still relied heavily on frameworks that would strike today's doctors as almost entirely mistaken. This is worth remembering as a check on how we judge Peter's medical enthusiasm. He wasn't importing anything resembling actual scientific medicine as we'd recognise it, since that framework simply didn't exist yet anywhere in the world, but he was genuinely trying to bring Russian medical practice into closer alignment with the most current thinking available in Western Europe at the time, whatever the real-world limitations of that thinking happened to be. One particularly significant medical development during this broader era deserves mention: smallpox inoculation, a crude precursor to vaccination involving deliberately exposing a healthy person to material from an infected individual's pustules in hopes of triggering a milder case that would confer future immunity, was beginning to circulate in various forms across parts of Europe and the Ottoman Empire during roughly this period, though it wouldn't become widely practiced in Russia until later in the 18th century, notably championed by Catherine the Great, who famously underwent inoculation herself decades after Peter's death to demonstrate its safety to a sceptical Russian public. Peter's reign predates this particular medical milestone reaching Russia in any significant way, meaning smallpox remained an essentially unmanageable threat throughout his lifetime, striking royalty and peasants alike with equal, terrifying indifference to social rank. All of this disease, all of this crude, well-intentioned but scientifically limited medical response, existed against a backdrop of rapidly changing Russian urban life. Because Peter wasn't content simply reforming existing cities, he was determined to build an entirely new capital from scratch, in a location that, from a public health perspective, was arguably one of the worst possible choices imaginable. And it's to that extraordinary, ambitious, genuinely brutal construction project that we now turn, because the marshy, disease-ridden ground upon which St. Petersburg rose would extract a sanitary cost from its builders that makes everything we've discussed so far tonight seem almost gentle by comparison. Follow the muddy footpaths now toward a stretch of low, waterlogged marshland at the mouth of the Neva River, because this is where Peter decided, with characteristic stubbornness, to build his glittering new capital city. And the human cost of that decision deserves to be told honestly, even in a gentle bedtime voice. Here's your mainstream historical fact to open this section. Construction of St. Petersburg began in 1703, on terrain that was fundamentally unsuitable for large-scale building, a delta region crisscrossed with waterways, prone to severe flooding, and sitting atop soil so marshy and waterlogged that foundations required massive quantities of imported stone, timber piling, and an almost unimaginable amount of forced labour simply to create ground stable enough to build upon at all. The human toll of this project was staggering, and historians studying the construction have documented death tolls that varied depending on which years and which specific sources you examine. But virtually all serious estimates agree that tens of thousands of labourers, conscripted from across the Russian Empire, died during the city's early construction years, from a brutal combination of disease, exhaustion, malnutrition, and the sheer physical danger of working in cold, wet, disease-prone marshland conditions with the primitive tools and safety standards of the early 18th century. Workers lived in makeshift camps, often without adequate shelter, clean water, or reliable food supplies in conditions that virtually guaranteed the spread of dysentery, typhus, and other diseases that thrive precisely in the crowded, poorly sanitized, waterlogged environments that St. Petersburg's construction sites represented almost by definition. It's worth pausing here to really sit with the scale of what this meant in practical physical terms, because it connects directly back to everything we've discussed tonight about hygiene, disease, and the human body under strain. Imagine thousands of men drafted from villages across the empire, transported to a marshy river delta given inadequate shelter, forced to labour in cold water and mud for hours daily, drinking water drawn from sources contaminated by the very human waste generated by the enormous crowded camps surrounding them. This wasn't a hygiene failure born of ignorance so much as a hygiene catastrophe, born of scale, speed, and Peter's absolute determination to see his new capital rise regardless of the human cost. A determination that historians across the political spectrum have generally agreed represented one of the most ruthless aspects of his entire reign. Here's your quirky, slightly fringe tidbit worth holding on to. A persistent popular legend claims saint. Petersburg was built on bones, a phrase still sometimes used today to describe the city, suggesting the sheer number of workers who died during construction left their remains essentially incorporated into the very ground the city stands upon. Historians generally treat this as poetic exaggeration rather than literal fact. The dead were not, as far as documented evidence shows, buried directly beneath building foundations in some deliberate or systematic way, but the persistence and emotional power of the legend itself tells you something important about how deeply the human cost of this project embedded itself in Russian cultural memory, becoming a kind of dark folklore attached to an otherwise magnificent, celebrated city. Historians still argue over precisely how reliable the earliest death toll estimates actually are, since record-keeping for conscripted labourers, particularly those who died far from home in chaotic construction camps, was inconsistent at best across the vast Russian Empire of this period. Peter's determination to push forward with this project despite the mounting human cost reveals something important about his broader relationship with sanitation and public welfare throughout his reign. This was a man capable of genuine, forward-thinking interest in urban hygiene and orderly infrastructure. Remember his admiration for Dutch canal systems and scrubbed streets. And yet, when that same vision collided with the immediate brutal logistics of actually building something at unprecedented speed and scale, sanitary consideration for ordinary labourers apparently took a distant backseat to raw ambition. Street. Petersburg would eventually become, over subsequent decades and centuries, a genuinely impressive planned city with wide avenues, canals, and architectural grandeur that fulfilled much of Peter's original vision. But that transformation happened gradually, long after the worst of the initial construction crisis had passed, and long after the immediate human cost had already been paid by workers whose individual names mostly disappeared from history entirely. The city's difficult marshland location continued causing practical sanitation challenges well beyond the initial construction period too, since a waterlogged river delta doesn't simply become easy to drain and manage once buildings go up. Flooding remained a recurring problem throughout St. Petersburg's early history, periodically overwhelming whatever drainage and waste management systems existed, and creating exactly the kind of standing water conditions that bred disease and discomfort in equal measure. Peter had, in essence, chosen to build his gleaming symbol of modernization on some of the least hygienic ground imaginable, a contradiction that mirrors so many others we've traced throughout tonight's story. Grand westernizing ambition colliding, again and again, with the messy, difficult, often brutal physical realities required to actually achieve it. And speaking of physical realities Peter embraced with genuine enthusiasm, despite considerable personal discomfort, it's time we return to the sea because Peter's lifelong love affair with ships and naval life shaped his tolerance for grime, cramped quarters, and salt-crusted discomfort in ways that reveal yet another layer of this fascinatingly contradictory man. Climb aboard now, because we're heading out onto open water, and if there's one environment where Peter the Great felt more genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy than almost anywhere else in his life, it was aboard a ship. Here's your mainstream historical fact to anchor this section. Peter's fascination with naval matters began in his childhood, sparked famously by his discovery of an old, abandoned English sailboat in a storehouse near Moscow, a boat he had restored and sailed on a nearby lake, an experience he later described with genuine sentiment for a man not known for excessive sentimentality as the origin of his lifelong passion for the sea. That childhood fascination grew into an obsession that shaped enormous portions of Russian state policy, driving Peter's determination to secure Russian access to warm water ports, to build a genuine modern navy essentially from nothing, and to personally master shipbuilding skills hands-on during his travels through Western Europe, skills he continued practicing and refining for the rest of his life. Naval life in this era, whether aboard a warship, a merchant vessel, or the various ships Peter personally helped design and build for the growing Russian fleet, meant embracing a level of physical discomfort and grime that most landlocked aristocrats never had to seriously consider. Ships were cramped, damp, and constantly exposed to seawater, which meant clothing stayed perpetually salt-crusted and difficult to fully dry, particularly on longer voyages. Fresh water for washing was a scarce, carefully rationed resource aboard most vessels of this era, generally prioritised for drinking rather than bathing, meaning sailors, and any Tsar who happened to be sailing among them, went considerably longer stretches without proper washing than even the already limited standards of land-based 17th and 18th century hygiene would suggest. Add the constant proximity to bilge water, the standing, often foul liquid that accumulates in a ship's lowest interior spaces, and you have an environment that smelled, by any objective modern standard, genuinely terrible. And Peter loved it. This is, again, the same man who insisted on performing dirty manual shipyard labour incognito in Holland, who apparently found genuine satisfaction in physical work regardless of the mess involved. Multiple accounts from Peter's life describe him spending extended periods aboard ships, sometimes preferring the cramped functional quarters of a working vessel to the elaborate comfort available to him in his own palaces, a preference that puzzled and occasionally exasperated the courtiers and foreign dignitaries who were expected to accompany him on these nautical adventures, whether they shared his enthusiasm or not. Peter reportedly took genuine pride in being able to perform every task required to operate and maintain a ship personally, from basic carpentry to actual sailing and navigation, treating naval competence as a fundamental measure of a man's worth, in a way that placed physical, hands-on capability well above elegant appearance or courtly refinement. Here's your quirky, slightly fringed tidbit worth savouring. Peter reportedly held the formal rank structure of the Russian Navy in genuine, sincere regard, and he insisted on earning his own military and naval promotions through demonstrated competence rather than simply claiming the highest rank by virtue of being Tsar, working his way up through recognised ranks over years, a practice virtually unheard of among European monarchs of his era, who typically simply assumed supreme military titles by default regardless of actual battlefield or naval experience. This detail reveals something genuinely distinctive about Peter's psychology, a monarch who seemed to derive real satisfaction from earned competence and hands-on mastery rather than purely inherited status, a value system that connects directly back to his enthusiasm for shipyard labour, amateur dentistry, and general hands-on tinkering across his entire life. Historians still argue over how much of this rank-earning behaviour reflected genuine humility versus a more calculated form of leadership theatre, designed to inspire loyalty and demonstrate competence to his officers and sailors, though given everything else we know about Peter's restless hands-on personality, genuine enthusiasm seems at least as plausible an explanation as calculation. The Baltic fleet Peter built from essentially nothing became one of the defining achievements of his reign, transforming Russia from a landlocked power with minimal naval presence into a genuine maritime force capable of contesting Swedish dominance in the Baltic Sea during the lengthy Great Northern War. This transformation required not just ships and sailors, but an entirely new relationship between the Russian state and the sea itself, one that Peter modelled personally, salt-crusted clothing and all, rather than simply commanding from a comfortable distance. It's genuinely remarkable when you step back and consider it, that a man who could command essentially unlimited luxury and comfort chose, repeatedly and consistently throughout his life, environments defined by physical hardship, cramped quarters, and honest, sweaty, salty grime, apparently finding in that discomfort a satisfaction that elaborate palace living never quite offered him. But bodies, even towering, restless, endlessly energetic ones, eventually begin showing the accumulated cost of a lifetime spent in exactly this kind of physical extremity, and as Peter aged, whispers and rumours about his declining health began circulating through court, whispers that historians have spent centuries since trying to sort through separate fact from exaggeration and understand what was truly happening inside the body of a man who had spent decades pushing himself and everyone around him well past what most humans would consider reasonable physical limits. Let your imagination drift now into the quieter, more shadowed corners of Peter's later years, because even the most restless, seemingly indestructible bodies eventually begin to falter, and the historical record surrounding Peter's declining health is genuinely fascinating precisely because it remains so incomplete and contested. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Peter suffered from various documented health problems in his later life, including what many historians believe were kidney or urinary tract issues, possibly involving kidney stones or related complications, conditions that would have caused him significant recurring pain and discomfort during his final years, compounded by the general physical toll of decades spent in the kind of relentless, physically demanding activity we've traced throughout tonight's entire story. The nature and severity of Peter's specific ailments remain genuinely debated among historians and medical historians who've tried to reconstruct his final health crisis using the limited, often contradictory accounts left behind by contemporaries. Some accounts emphasise what sounds like a serious urinary or kidney condition that worsened progressively over his final years, possibly linked to years of heavy drinking, an enormous and physically demanding workload, and general disregard for his own bodily limits in favour of relentless activity. Other historical interpretations have pointed toward the possibility of venereal disease contracted at some point during his notoriously active personal life, though this particular theory remains considerably more speculative and contested than the kidney-related explanations, resting on fragmentary evidence and the kind of retrospective diagnosis that modern historians generally treat with appropriate caution. Here's your quirky, slightly fringe tidbit worth tucking away tonight. Some later biographers and medical historians have speculated that Peter's decades of heavy drinking, documented so thoroughly through accounts of his mock drinking synod and legendary banquet endurance, may have contributed significantly to progressive liver or kidney damage that compounded whatever underlying conditions were already troubling him, though establishing definitive causation across 3 centuries of incomplete medical records remains, honestly, more educated guesswork than firm diagnosis. Historians still argue vigorously over exactly how much weight to give these various competing theories, since the surviving accounts from Peter's own physicians, while detailed by the standards of their era, were working within the same limited humoral medical framework we discussed earlier, meaning even the most careful contemporary observations were filtered through diagnostic categories that don't map cleanly onto modern medical understanding of kidney disease, liver damage, or infection. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Peter's final years were marked by increasingly severe episodes of pain and illness, periods where even this famously indefatigable man was forced to slow down, something that must have felt genuinely alien to someone who had spent his entire adult life defined by constant motion, constant labour, constant activity. Court records from his final year or so describe increasingly frequent bouts of illness, periods of genuine incapacitation that stood in stark, almost jarring contrast to the man who had personally worked shipyards, pulled teeth, and outdrunk his entire court through decades of relentless physical engagement with the world around him. There's something genuinely poignant in this contrast, worth sitting with quietly for a moment. A body built for constant, aggressive motion, finally, slowly, being forced into stillness by forces even an emperor couldn't outhammer or outdrink. It's worth connecting this back to the broader medical landscape we explored a few sections ago, because Peter's own physicians, despite his personal enthusiasm for supporting Western medical education and hospital development in Russia, were still operating within essentially the same limited framework we discussed regarding smallpox and plague treatment. Humoral theory, bloodletting, purging, and various remedies that, however sincerely applied, had little genuine capacity to address whatever was actually happening inside Peter's ageing, overworked body. The genuine irony here is worth appreciating. A man who spent decades trying to drag Russian medicine into closer alignment with the most current European practices ultimately found himself, in his own final illness, essentially at the mercy of medical science that simply hadn't yet developed the tools to properly diagnose or treat whatever was actually killing him. This growing physical vulnerability sets the stage for one of the most dramatic and most frequently cited episodes in the traditional narrative of Peter's decline. A cold, dangerous rescue operation on the water that many historical accounts point to as the final, decisive blow to an already weakened body. Whether this single dramatic incident truly caused his death, or merely accelerated an ending that was already approaching through the slow accumulation of kidney trouble, heavy drinking, and decades of relentless physical strain, remains, like so much else in tonight's story, a question historians continue turning over. But the story itself, dramatic and cold and genuinely moving in its own way, deserves to be told properly, slowly, the way all good bedtime stories eventually arrive at their quiet, inevitable conclusion. Picture the scene now, one final time, because we're arriving at the icy waters near the Gulf of Finland in the autumn of 1724, where the story most commonly told about Peter's final decline takes place. Here's your mainstream historical fact for tonight's penultimate chapter. In November of 1724, Peter reportedly waded into frigid coastal waters, according to the traditional account, to personally help rescue soldiers or sailors from a boat that had run aground or was in danger of sinking near St. Petersburg, throwing himself physically into the rescue effort, despite the freezing conditions and his already weakened, aging body. This act of hands-on heroism, so entirely consistent with everything we've learned about Peter's character throughout tonight's journey, his refusal to simply command from a comfortable distance, his instinct to physically involve himself in whatever crisis or task lay before him, is traditionally credited with worsening whatever underlying illness already troubled him, exposing his body to a cold, prolonged shock that his weakened kidneys and general constitution simply couldn't recover from. Peter died on the 28th of January 1725 at the age of 52, after weeks of declining health following this dramatic autumn incident, his final months marked by increasing pain and periods of incapacitation that his physicians, working within their limited medical framework, could do little to genuinely address. His death marked the end of a reign that had lasted over 4 decades and had transformed Russia more dramatically, more rapidly, and more forcefully than perhaps any single reign in the nation's entire history, reshaping everything from its capital city to its calendar, its military, its relationship with the Orthodox Church, and yes, even its facial hair. Here's your quirky, slightly fringed tidbit for this section, and it's a genuinely important one for keeping our story intellectually honest. Historians still argue, quite seriously, over how much weight to actually give this dramatic icy rescue story as the true, decisive cause of Peter's death. Some modern historians treat it as likely exaggerated or even largely mythologized, a dramatic, symbolically fitting story that later biographers and chroniclers found irresistible, precisely because it fit Peter's established character so perfectly, the tireless, hands-on emperor literally sacrificing his own health in one final act of physical heroism for his people. The more sceptical historical view suggests Peter's health had already been declining seriously and steadily for years before this incident, driven by the kidney or urinary complications, heavy drinking, and general physical exhaustion we discussed in the previous section, and that the icy rescue, even if it genuinely happened roughly as described, was likely just one contributing factor among several, rather than the single, dramatic, decisive cause popular history has long preferred to tell. This tension between the dramatic popular narrative and the more cautious, multi-causal historical reality is, honestly, a fitting note to strike as tonight's story winds toward its close, because it echoes so many of the contradictions and uncertainties we've traced throughout Peter's entire life. Was he a genuine hygiene reformer, or simply a man imposing surface-level Western fashion onto a court whose actual bathing practices, rooted in the Banya, were already arguably more effective than the powdered, perfumed alternatives he admired? Was his enormous physical energy, his restless hands-on engagement with shipyards, dentistry and rescue operations, a genuine expression of curiosity and duty, or a lifelong unconscious attempt to outrun the childhood trauma that first set that restlessness into motion? Historians continue debating these questions precisely because Peter himself seems to have never fully resolved them, living his entire life as a genuine walking contradiction between East and West, tradition and reform, careful discipline and gleeful chaos. What we can say with real confidence, drawing together everything we've explored across tonight's long, sleepy journey, is that Peter's relationship with his own body, and with the whole question of cleanliness and physical care was never simple, never fully consistent, and never quite as straightforward as either the popular image of an enlightened Western reformer or the popular image of a filthy, barbaric Eastern despot would suggest. He was a man who embraced the Banya's ancient steam and cold plunge, even while forcing his court into powdered European wigs. A man who insisted on scrubbed, orderly city streets while personally spending decades in shipyard grime, dental gore, and salt-crusted naval discomfort. A man capable of genuine tenderness and hands-on heroism, wading into icy water for strangers, while also capable of watching tens of thousands of conscripted labourers die building his dream city on unforgiving marshland. That contradiction, that genuine, unresolved human complexity, is ultimately far more interesting and far more true than any simple, tidy verdict on Peter's hygiene, his character or his legacy could ever fully capture. And as your own eyelids grow heavier now as this long night's journey through steam and sawdust, banquets and toothkeys, marshland and salt spray finally begins settling toward its close, it's worth drifting gently into what Peter actually left behind, the lasting tangible legacy of a filth-tolerant, contradiction-filled modernizer whose reforms would echo through Russian history for centuries after his own restless body finally, quietly, came to rest. Let everything settle now, slowly, like steam finally dispersing from an old banya after the last bather has gone home for the night. Peter the Great left Russia utterly transformed, and so much of what he built outlasted him by centuries. St. Petersburg, built on that brutal marshland at such devastating human cost, became one of the world's genuinely great cities, its wide avenues and elegant canals eventually fulfilling the vision Peter carried with him from those Dutch shipyards so many years before. The navy he built from nothing continued growing long after his death, cementing Russia's place as a genuine maritime and European power. Even the beard tax and the clean-shaven faces, symbolically small as they might seem beside warships and new capitals, represented something larger, a Russia permanently, irreversibly turned toward engagement with the wider world, for better and for worse, in ways it could never fully undo. And the Banya, that steaming wooden room where this whole story quietly began, is still there too, still standing in Russian towns and cities today, largely unchanged in its essential rhythm of heat, birch branches and cold plunge, a tradition that outlasted every powdered wig and perfumed courtier Peter ever admired. Perhaps that's the gentlest, truest lesson tucked inside this whole long, contradictory story. That Peter, for all his restless reaching toward the West, never quite let go of the one hygiene tradition that actually worked, the one his own body, tall and tired and aching by the end, still trusted more than anything imported from abroad. You can let your breathing slow now, matching the quiet rhythm of that old bathhouse ritual, heat rising, then easing, then rising again, gentler each time. Peter's story, like so many we've wandered through together, was never really about being purely clean or purely dirty, purely modern or purely traditional. It was about a restless, complicated man doing his very human best to hold two worlds together in one enormous, aching, salt-crusted body. And now, as the candle gutters low and the night settles fully around you, you can set that whole complicated story down gently, the way you'd set down a heavy coat after a long journey and simply rest. The steam has cleared, the banquet hall has emptied, the ships are quiet at anchor. Somewhere far off, a fire is dying down to embers, and there's nothing left to do now but close your eyes, breathe slowly, and drift. End of script. Sweet dreams.